Sego Sewagwag, Watquinoradon, G the Hidden Coffee House Podcast. Satakayon den Junget, so Gadi Jorhansa, Andrew Niwaxanoda, Brandon Waxanazare. Hello everyone, welcome to the Hidden Coffee House Podcast. I'm Satakayon, or my English name is Andrew Brandt. I teach Mohawk language and First Nations Métis and Inuit studies. I'm an advocate for Indigenous rights, and sometimes you can find me on the stage as well. This November, come to Picton in beautiful Prince Edward County for the second run of Shatterbox Theatre's production of Cabaret the Musical. The first run was completely sold out, huge wait list, so don't wait to get your tickets because we won't be coming back again. I'll be returning to my role as the outgoing Ernst Ludwig once again as the Cape is transformed into the seedy Kit Kat Club in the underbelly of 1930s Berlin, because here, life is beautiful. Get your tickets at kitkatclub.ca. That's kitkatclub.ca. And follow Kit Kat Club PEC and Shatterbox Theatre on social media. They're already going fast, and the show is not until November, so book your table. You'll love it. When a government tells you it cares about education, you have to look past the press conference, the headline, and carefully chosen words. You have to look at what it has actually done. In Ontario right now, the truth could not be clearer. We are living in a moment where the Ford government, through the Education Minister Paul Calandra, is not just tinkering with education policy, not just shifting dollars around, but openly dismantling the democratic structures that keep schools accountable to the people they serve. This is not theory. It's happening in real time. 5 school boards have already been stripped of their elected authority and placed under provincial supervision. Trustees, the local representatives that families elect to speak for them, have been told to step aside, their voices replaced by provincially appointed supervisors. And while Calandra insists this is about accountability, about ensuring that money is spent responsibly, the reality is far starker. This is about centralization of power. It's about control. It's about silencing those who might resist or expose what's really going on. In Ontario, trustees are not just some abstract position. They're often the only direct connection between families and the education system's governance. They're the people who sit in community halls, who answer parents' phone calls when a child with special needs is not getting support, who push back when boards try to cut Indigenous programming or close schools that serve marginalized neighborhoods. They are imperfect, but they are elected. They're the public's entry point to the system. To erase them is to erase that voice. The Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario did not mince words when Calandra made his intentions clear. They called it authoritarianism. Their statement warned that it's not about education reform, but, quote, authoritarianism designed to deflect blame, suppress dissenting voices, and tighten political control, unquote. When the people tasked with teaching our children every day say this is about silencing and control, we need to listen. They're sounding the alarm because they know exactly what it looks like when decisions are made without accountability. They live with the consequences every day in overcrowded classrooms, in schools where repairs are endlessly delayed, in the absence of supports that should have been there years ago. And while the Ford government is gutting accountability on one hand, it's introducing surveillance and control on the other. The plan to reintroduce school resource officers, police in schools, is not about making students safer. It's about managing them, policing them, and controlling them. We know from the Ontario Human Rights Commission that police presence disproportionately harms Black and Indigenous students. That adds another layer of fear for those already dealing with systemic discrimination. Yet instead of listening to those findings, instead of respecting the decisions of school boards that ended these programs after extensive consultation, the province has decided to force them back in. The timing's no accident. Remove the trustees, silence the community voices, and then roll out policing in schools. With fewer checks and balances, with fewer opportunities for families to speak up through their elected representatives, the government can push through measures that communities have already rejected. That's not democracy, that's domination. For public schools, the impact is immediate. When trustees are muzzled, when decisions are dictated by supervisors who answer directly to Queen's Park, the unique needs of communities get lost. A trustee from Toronto speaking to the Canadian Jewish News after the political takeover said it plainly, quote, "I'm incredibly disappointed and saddened for what it may mean to the system that we have worked for years and years on," unquote. That sadness is not abstract. It's the grief of someone who has spent years trying to build a system more responsive to students, only to see it yanked out of the community's hands. And the teachers know what's coming too. The Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation said it directly in their response to the 2025 budget. Quote, "Once again, the Ford government has failed to address the worsening crisis in our schools. Daily staff shortages, ballooning class sizes, insufficient mental health and special education supports, crumbling infrastructure," unquote. These are not partisan talking points. They're the lived reality in classrooms across Ontario. And when you combine those failures with the removal of trustees, you get a system where the government both starves schools of resources and silences the people who might hold it accountable. Now let's talk about what this means beyond the provincial system, because it doesn't stop there. First Nations controlled schools may not be under their direct authority of provincial trustees, but the ripple effects are real. First Nations schools are already underfunded, already dealing with infrastructure gaps, already negotiating against the weight of a province that frames itself as the standard against which all others are measured. When provincial public schools are weakened, it makes it even harder for First Nations to press for equitable treatment. Think about transitions. Many First Nations students attend provincial high schools after leaving community schools. If those schools are now more heavily policed, less accountable, and stripped of local voices, those students are walking into a hostile environment. They're entering spaces where their safety is compromised and their cultural needs are pushed aside. That's not a small thing. That is the daily reality of Indigenous youth who already face barriers in education. And it goes deeper. The Assembly of First Nations has documented for decades how federal funding for on-reserve schools has lagged behind. Per-student funding increases were capped while populations grew, leaving First Nations schools falling further behind. Shannon's Dream, the campaign led by students themselves, made it clear what was at stake: safe and comfy schools on reserves and culturally based education. Yeah, here we are, more than a decade later, still fighting those battles. When the province destabilizes its own system and centralizes control, it weakens the pressure to address those inequities. It makes it easier for both levels of government to point fingers at each other while children sit in classrooms that do not meet the basic standards of equity. So, what we're witnessing right now is not just a fight about trustees or one program. It's about whether communities, Indigenous and non Indigenous, will be allowed to have a say in how their children are educated. It's about whether accountability will live at the local level or whether it'll be crushed under the weight of provincial control and surveillance. It's about whether schools are places of learning or places of policing. Supervision is not a neutral act. When the province sends in a supervisor, that person does not just help the board. They take control of its finances, its decisions, and its ability to speak publicly. Trustees may still technically exist, but their role is gutted. They can no longer vote on budgets, direct policy, or push back on provincial orders. They become the window dressing, the figures meant to give the appearance of local democracy while real power is exercised from Queen's Park. For families, that means when they call their trustee about a problem, a child's not receiving the accommodations guaranteed under their IEP, a school about to lose its Indigenous language program, or a building with mold spreading across classrooms, the trustee has no power to act. They can listen, they can empathize, but they can't change the outcome. The decisions are made elsewhere by someone who has no accountability to the people in that community. And that's what Calandra has already done to 5 boards. and what he's threatening to do across the province. This is not just about silencing dissent. It's about reshaping the very definition of education governance. Ontario has long had a model where local voices had a say in how schools were run, however imperfect that system was. By undermining that, the government has signaled that education is not a matter of community, but of provincial control. And in a province as large and diverse as Ontario, that shift is devastating. What works in Thunder Bay is not the same as what works in Scarborough. What a First Nations student needs walking into a public high school is not the same as what a suburban school board prioritizes. Local trustees have historically been the ones to bridge those differences. Remove them, and you flatten education into a one size fits all model dictated by politics, not by need. We also have to be honest about what this looks like in practice. When those boards lose autonomy, the first programs to go are the ones that serve marginalized communities. Indigenous curriculum, Black history courses, LGBTQ2S plus supports, equity focused initiatives, all these are vulnerable when local champions are silenced. Trustees are often the ones who fight to protect these programs, who make sure they do not get lost in the shuffle of budget shortfalls and provincial priorities. With supervisors in place, those fights are harder to win. Decisions are reduced to line items, stripped of the human stories and cultural significance they carry. At the same time, the Ford government is using police as a substitute for resources. Bringing back school resource officers is not about safety, and we know it. Safety comes from smaller class sizes, from mental health supports, from schools with proper ventilation and repairs. Safety comes from trust between educators and students, but the government has chosen to put armed authority into hallways instead. That choice says everything about their priorities. We've lived through this before. Toronto ended its SRO program years after organizing by Black students who spoke about how police presence made them feel unsafe, surveilled, and targeted. The Peel District School Board was investigated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which found patterns of racial discrimination, disproportionate suspensions, and expulsions that affected Black and Indigenous students the most. These aren't abstract risks, they're documented realities. To force police back into schools after that history is to deliberately ignore the evidence and the lived experience of most of the students harmed, and the students that are most harmed. And again, look at the timing. With trustees sidelined, boards under supervision, who's left to say no? Who can speak with authority for the community? The government had designed this sequence carefully. First, remove the voices that would resist, then implement the measures these voices had already rejected. It's not sloppy, it's calculated. For public schools, the damage will show quickly. Classrooms already overcrowded will not get relief. Teachers already stretched to the breaking point will see no new supports. Students who need mental health resources will continue to wait. And instead of trustees raising hell about it, communities will be met with silence from supervisors whose loyalty is to the minister, not families. The image of accountability will remain. The school board will still technically exist, but the substance is gone. Now, think about what this does to Indigenous students entering these spaces. For many, the transition from a First Nations controlled school to a provincial high school is already jarring. They go from a setting where their culture and identity are centered to one where they're often invisible. Supports are limited, curriculum representation is inconsistent, and racism is an everyday reality. Add police in the hallways and remove trustees who might have advocated for them, and you have an environment that's not just indifferent, but actively hostile. That hostility drives dropout rates, erodes trust, and pushes Indigenous students further from opportunities they deserve. First Nations controlled schools feel this in another way too. They're consistently compared to provincial schools, consistently and constantly pressured to keep up despite chronic underfunding from the federal government. When provincial schools are destabilized, the comparison shifts. Governments can deflect responsibility more easily. If provincial schools are under supervision, if they're struggling, then the inequities facing First Nation schools becomes easier to dismiss. The bar is lowered for everyone, and the students who already face the deepest inequities are pushed further into the margins. The Assembly of First Nations laid this bare in its review of K-12 education funding. While provincial funding kept pace with inflation and population growth, federal funding for on-reserve schools was capped, leaving a widening gap. This is not new information. Shannon Kustachin and Shannon's Dream campaign shouted it from the rooftops more than a decade ago. First Nations children deserve safe schools and culturally based education, yet here we are in 2025 watching Ontario destabilize its own system while First Nations schools are struggling and fighting for the basics. The connection is clear. When Ontario undermines accountability in its public schools, it hurts First Nations schools too. It erodes the leverage to demand better. It narrows the space where Indigenous curriculum can grow. It puts more students at risk when they enter provincial schools, and now they're more heavily policed and less accountable. And it sends a message that education is not about communities or children, but about control and politics. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Ford government's approach. When they came to power, they cut education to the bone. They canceled programs, froze funding, and dismissed the concerns of educators. They rolled back curriculum that included modern sex ed and Indigenous perspectives. They slashed support for vulnerable students. And now, with the system weakened and families frustrated, they present themselves as the one who will fix it. They blame trustees. They blame boards. They blame everyone but themselves. And their solution is to seize more power, not to restore what they took away. That's where we are today. Trustees silenced, supervisors installed, police marching back into the hallways, First Nations schools left to struggle in the shadow of a provincial system that has lost its voice. This is not accountability or reform. This is control, plain and simple. The real question is whether we'll recognize it for what it is and whether we will fight for something different. Because education should never be about domination. It should be about communities, about children, and about preparing the next generation not just to survive, but to thrive. And right now, Ontario is heading in the opposite direction. When a school board is placed under supervision, the government likes to present it as a technical fix. The language is sterile, administrative, almost bureaucratic in its calmness. They say it's about oversight and stability. They say it's about ensuring sound financial management. What they don't say is that it means every decision a board would normally make, from how to balance the budget to what programs to protect to whether a trustee's motion can come to the table, is taken out of local hands and placed in the grip of the minister's appointee. This is not shifting of paperwork, it's the stripping away of power. Trustees are not only elected officials, they're the conduits of voices that otherwise get ignored. When those trustees are silenced, parents who fight for accommodations for their children with disabilities lose an advocate. Communities that push for Indigenous curriculum and cultural programming lose their defender. Equity initiatives that depend on someone at the governance table championing them are left exposed, vulnerable to the red pen of provincial supervisors tasked with finding efficiencies. Supervision in practice means austerity. It means the first thing on the chopping block will be the programs that can't easily be quantified in financial spreadsheets. Cultural programming, Indigenous language supports, anti-racism initiatives, LGBTQ resources, all of these live in budget lines that a supervisor will view as negotiable. And without trustees to fight them, those programs are easy targets. The province knows this. They know that by sending in a supervisor, they're not just fixing financial issues. They're reshaping the priorities of education to reflect the politics of Queen's Park. If Calandra wants to push his voice of control and uniformity, supervisors are his blunt instrument. They flatten local decision-making into provincial compliance. And what does that mean for the students? It means slow erosion of the spaces where they might have found safety, representation, or recognition. It means that equity becomes an afterthought, not a principle. It means that Indigenous students who finally saw their histories and perspectives entering the classroom can watch that progress stall or reverse the moment it becomes too expensive for a supervisor's budget. This is not speculation, it's a pattern. Every time governments in Ontario have imposed austerity measures, it's been equity and special education programs that suffer first. We saw it in the Harris years when sweeping cuts gutted classrooms. We saw it again when Ford's first government cut teaching positions and scrapped curriculum modernization. We're seeing it once more, dressed up in the language of supervision and responsibility. Trustees know it too. They've been blunt about what this takeover means. One Toronto trustee called it devastating, describing years of work being ripped away in an instant. That grief isn't personal, it's collective. It's the grief of knowing that all the late nights, the community consultations, the endless fights to hold the system accountable can be wiped out by a single order from Queen's Park. Unions have echoed the same warnings. OSSTF, in their budget response this year, cataloged the failures of the Ford government in sharp detail. Quote, daily staff shortages, ballooning class sizes, insufficient mental health and special education supports for crumbling infrastructure, end quote. When those are conditions on the ground, silencing trustees and imposing supervisors doesn't fix anything. It simply ensures that the government can no longer publicly be challenged about it. The image of control replaces the reality of care. And then there's the question of trust. Schools function not only because of curriculum and funding, but because communities believe that they have a stake in them. They're stakeholders. Parents show up at trustee meetings because they believe their voices matter. Students organize protests because they believe their boards can be pressured to change. When the province removes trustees and neuters boards, that belief collapses. Families are left shouting into the void. The message is clear. Decisions will be made for you, not with you. For Indigenous families, that message carries a particular sting. It's a reminder of how colonial systems have always operated. Decisions imposed without consultation, policies enacted without consent, lives reshaped by governments that never asked what communities needed. When Indigenous students transition into provincial schools that are now under supervision, they're stepping into yet another layer of imposed authority. Trustees who might have been allies, who might have pushed back against provincial indifference, are gone. The chain of accountability is severed. This is where the contrast with First Nations controlled schools becomes critical. On reserve schools are governed through different structures, accountable to chiefs and councils or education authorities rooted in community. They too are not perfect, and they are hamstrung by chronic federal underfunding, but they represent an attempt to center Indigenous governance and education. Compare that with what's happening now in Ontario, a deliberate stripping of community voice, a consolidation of authority in provincial hands, and reintroduction of policing in the face of student support. The divergence could not be starker. One system is fighting to hold on to community-based accountability. The other is running in the opposite direction, dismantling it. And the cost isn't abstract either. It shows up in the lives of students. A student who once had access to an Indigenous language program because a trustee fought for its funding may now find that program is gone. A student who counted on equity initiatives to feel safe in their identity may now find these supports erased. A student with special needs may find that the fight for accommodations has become harder because the person who once took those fights to the board has now been silenced. That's the practical reality of supervision. It's not about balance sheets and audits. It's about children losing opportunities, supports, and advocates. It's about families losing faith that the system will respond to them and the government engineering silence where there was once resistance. This is the deeper danger. Once supervision becomes normalized, it can be applied anywhere, at any time, for any reason the minister deems sufficient. It sets a precedent that no board is safe from takeover, that no trustee's work is secure. No community can assume it has a guaranteed voice. The chilling effect is immense. Even boards not yet under supervision may begin to self-censor to avoid decisions that could trigger provincial intervention. That's how control spreads, not just through direct takeovers, but through the fear of them. For First Nations school, the consequences ripple again. When provincial schools lose their autonomy, it reduces the space for collaboration and cultural partnerships. Boards that once worked with First Nations educators to integrate programming may now be reluctant to take risks or spread resources on those initiatives. Supervisors focused on efficiency are unlikely to prioritize cultural responsiveness. The result is another layer of erasure, another narrowing of opportunities for Indigenous knowledge to be present in the classroom. Meanwhile, the funding inequities remain entrenched. The AFN's costing analysis showed the depth of the gap between the federal funding for on-reserve schools and provincial spending on off-reserve students. That gap has not been closed. And yet, with Ontario now destabilizing its own schools, governments can point fingers more easily. The province can say it's doing its best under supervision. The federal government can say provincial systems are also struggling. In the end, no one takes responsibility, and Indigenous students are left to pay the price. This is why the fight over trustees and supervision matters so much. It's not a technical debate. It's not an administrative shuffle. It's about whether communities have a voice in education or whether that voice will be silenced entirely. It's about whether Indigenous perspectives will have allies in governance or whether they'll be sidelined once again. It's about accountability. It's about whether accountability will live in neighborhoods or whether it'll be hoarded in the minister's office. The Ford government wants you to believe it's about efficiency, but efficiency is the language of erasure. Efficiency is the excuse used to cut the programs that don't fit neatly into financial models. Efficiency is the justification for ignoring the messy, difficult human needs that schools exist to serve. Efficiency in the hands of this government is a weapon. And with supervisors in place, it's a weapon they can wield without resistance. So what we have to ask is who benefits from this arrangement? It's not the students whose classrooms remain overcrowded. It's not the teachers whose workloads keep climbing. It's not the families whose voices are muting. The only people who benefit are those in power who can now claim control while avoiding accountability. That is the heart of this governance crisis. It's not about fixing schools, it's about consolidating authority. And it sets the stage for what comes next. A government that cut education to the bone now parading as its savior. Trustees cast as villains, supervisors as heroes, police as protectors. It's a theater of control scripted to distract from the real issues. And while the actors play their roles, the students, especially Indigenous students, are the ones left to live with the consequences. If you want to see what supervision really means, you only need to follow the money. Boards under takeover quickly find that budgets are reframed. Programs that once reflected community priorities are rewritten into cost centers. A youth mental health initiative becomes a line item. An Indigenous language program becomes non-essential service. Equity staff are reclassified as supplementary. It's not that these programs are formally outlawed. It's that they're steadily defunded, deprioritized, and cut back until they exist in name only. The shift is devastating for special education in particular. Parents of children with exceptionalities have always had to fight for accommodations, always. For educational assistance, for timely assessments, trustees, flawed as they may be, or at least a path to escalate those fights. A trustee could table a motion, demand an audit, or force senior staff to account for failures. Under supervision, that path closes. Families may still raise their concern, but they hit a wall. A provincial supervisor has no political need to listen to a parent in crisis. Their job is to deliver a budget that pleases the minister. And if that means slashing supports, so be it. And here is where the racial and cultural discrimination comes in again. Special education is already rife with inequities. Indigenous students are more likely to be misidentified as having behavioral problems rather than being recognized for learning needs. Black students are disproportionately streamed into special education categories that limit their academic options. When trustees lose power, when equity officers are seen as expendable, those systemic injustices deepen. The safety valves in the system are stripped away. Educators know this, and they're not staying quiet. ETFO called the province's moves authoritarian, but they're also spelled out the consequences. They said that the government was, quote, deflecting blame, suppressing dissenting voices, and tightening political control, end quote. That is not just rhetoric. It's a clear description of how this supervision model works. By silencing trustees, the government has ensured that teachers' warnings, parents' complaints, and students' protests are contained. They no longer reach decision makers who have the independence to act. The chilling effect is not limited to the boards under supervision. Across Ontario, trustees are watching what is happening and calculating their risks. If they push too hard on equity, if they resist too openly, they risk attracting the minister's attention. That threat of a takeover becomes a tool of discipline, forcing boards to toe the line even without direct supervision. It's the same tactic colonial governments have always used. Punish a few publicly to keep the rest in check. And for Indigenous families, the colonial echoes are unmistakable. Supervision is imposed authority. It's a government saying, we know better than you. We'll decide what's best for your children. That was the language of residential schools. That was the language of Indian agents. That was the language of every policy that denied Indigenous peoples the right to make decisions for themselves. Now it's the language of Queen's Park, applied to the governments of education for everyone. The irony is sharp. While First Nations communities have fought for decades to reclaim control over their schools, to rebuild systems accountable to them rather than imposed from the outside, Ontario is dismantling its own democratic governance and moving towards centralization. One system fights to escape colonial control while the other races towards it. The juxtaposition should alarm everyone. And yet, the government frames it as common sense. They say trustees are wasteful. They say boards are dysfunctional. They say supervisors are there to help. But if this were about help, the province would be funding schools adequately. If this were about help, they would be repairing crumbling buildings and hiring more staff. They'd be listening to educators who've been warning of crises for years. Instead, their only consistent action has been to take away power from the communities and concentrate it into their own hands. The result is a system that looks more orderly on paper, but it's more chaotic in reality. Schools can't meet the needs of their students because resources are cut. Families can't hold anyone accountable because trustees are silent. Teachers can't innovate or respond to crises because the system has been stripped down to its bones, and students, especially those already marginalized, fall further behind. Consider the impact on Indigenous curriculum specifically. For years, boards across Ontario have been slowly integrating Indigenous histories and perspectives, often at the urging of trustees who understood their community's needs. Those programs are fragile. They rely on local champions, on budget commitments, on political will at the board table. Under supervision, they're easy to cut. And when they are cut, the already limited representation of Indigenous voices in provincial schools shrinks further. That loss is not just symbolic. It's another message to Indigenous students that their stories don't matter, that their histories are expendable. For First Nations controlled schools, the ripple is more subtle than just harmful. Many communities partner with For First Nations controlled schools, the ripple is more subtle but just as harmful. Many communities partner with local boards for resources, professional development, or transitions. When those boards are under supervision, their ability to collaborate shrinks. Supervisors are not interested in building partnerships. They're interested in balancing budgets. That makes it harder for First Nations schools to access supports they need, harder for them to advocate for equitable treatment, harder for them to ensure their students are not left behind when they move to provincial schools. Those transitions are critical. Every year, Indigenous students leave community schools to attend high schools off reserve. If those high schools are now more heavily policed, less culturally responsive, and stripped of local authority, those students face even greater barriers. Dropout rates are going to rise, trust in the system falls, the cycle of alienation deepens, and none of it can be dismissed as accidental. It's the predictable outcome of governance built on silencing rather than listening. This is the hidden cost of Calandra's approach. It's not just that trustees lose their seats at the table, it's that students lose their supports, families lose their advocates, and communities lose their voices. It's that Indigenous education, already underfunded and marginalized, becomes even harder to sustain in the shadow of a provincial system bent on control. The Ford government can pretend this is about responsibility. They can claim they're protecting taxpayers. They can posture as the adults in the room. But the truth is that they're engineering silence. They're stripping away the messy, difficult democratic process of local governance and replacing it with top-down control. And in doing so, they're repeating the very patterns of colonialism that have damaged education for generations. So we have to name it for what it is. Supervision is not a neutral tool. It's not a temporary measure. It's a political weapon. It's a way to enforce austerity, suppress dissent, and reintroduce policing as the answer to systemic failures. It's the latest chapter in a long history of governments choosing control over care. And it leaves us with a choice. Do we accept this silence or do we resist it? Do we allow education to be reshaped into a system of surveillance and compliance, or do we fight to reclaim it as a space of learning, equity, and community accountability? That choice is not just for public schools. It's for all of us. Because when one system is silenced, the echo reaches every other. Doug Ford and Paul Calandra walk into a school board meeting. No, that's not a setup to a joke. That's the whole disaster. Let's be honest, if you'd written everything down the Ford government has done to education over the last 7 years and pitched it as a comedy script, producers would have told you it was too far-fetched. Nobody would actually cut thousands of teaching positions, then complain about shortages. Nobody would cancel curriculum without modernization, then wonder why schools are behind. Nobody would scrap Indigenous curriculum writing and then claim to care about reconciliation. Nobody would increase class sizes, then act shocked that students are struggling. But here we are. Ford came to power with a chainsaw, and Calandra showed up with a gasoline, and now they're standing in front of a smoldering wreckage, insisting that they're the firefighters. Take trustees. According to Calandra, trustees are the problem. Those pesky elected voices who dare to ask questions, sometimes even resist. So what's the solution? Easy. Replace them with supervisors who only answer to him. It's like blaming the smoke detector for the fire and then ripping it off the ceiling. Congratulations, Paul. You've solved accountability by making sure there's nobody left to hold you accountable. And of course, when you centralize power, you need distraction. Enter school resource officers, because nothing says we care about kids like reintroducing police into schools after communities already said no. It's a bold strategy. Ignore decades of evidence, pretend the OHRC never existed, and then sell it back to the public as safety. Safety from what, exactly? Crumbling ceilings? Overcrowded classrooms? Kids sharing outdated textbooks? Nah, the real danger is apparently a grade 9 with a skateboard. Ford and Calandra act like trustees are wasting money. But let's talk about the waste. This government has burned through millions fighting teachers in court. They wasted billions trying to privatize healthcare. They threw money at developers who were ready to pave over the greenbelt. But sure, the real villains and the trust are the trustees with a budget line for Indigenous curriculum or mental health supports. And the hypocrisy does not stop there. They want accountability everywhere, except for themselves. They'll slap a supervisor on a board for running a deficit while their own ministries are riddled with scandals. They'll send police into schools in the name of order while their own caucus can't order a press conference without stumbling over the talking points. They'll talk about efficiency while shoveling cash into the boongoggles of nobody asked for. Let's talk about Ford for a second. This is the same man who canceled free tuition for low-income students, who tried to ram bigger class sizes down every family's throat, and who thought students could learn French online without a teacher. He treats education like a budget nuisance, not a public good. The man who wouldn't know pedagogy if it bit him on the timbit. And Calandra, he is Ford's hype man with a fancier vocabulary. His big idea is that democracy is inconvenient. Parents and students get a little too loud, shut the board down. Trustees raise questions, mute them. Communities don't want police in schools. Nah, let's force them back anyway. Calandra isn't an education minister, he's a hall monitor with delusions of grandeur. And while they all play their little power games, First Nation schools are still waiting. Shannon's dream called for safe, culturally based schools more than a decade ago. Kids are still in portables, still underfunded, and still forgotten. Ford and Calandra can send supervisors into downtown boards faster than you can say power grab, but when it comes to Indigenous education, suddenly it's all shrugs and finger pointing. The concern for their students has a boundary line, and it stops at the edge of the reserve. This is where it stops getting funny and gets raw, because the hypocrisy isn't just irritating, it's harmful. It's it's kids losing programs, it's families losing advocates, it's Indigenous students walking into provincial schools with police in the halls and no trustees to defend them. It's democracy stripped bare and sold back as efficiency. So, Ford and Calandra are not fixing education. They're staging education. They're performing accountability while silencing voices. They're pretending to save what they've already gutted. And the punchline is that they expect us to thank them for it. Doug Ford and Paul Calandra, you've managed to turn Ontario's education system into your own personal sitcom, except nobody's laughing. And the kids sure as hell aren't learning. The Ford government wants to convince you that the salvation of Ontario's schools can be found in a grade 10 math literacy test. They present it as accountability, as a way to ensure students are ready for the future. They talk about math as if it's the single measure of intelligence, the ultimate standard by which all learning can be judged. But let's not be fooled, this is not about math. It's about control. We've seen this script before. In 2001, George W. Bush launched No Child Left Behind in the United States. It was sold as a promise that every child would receive a good education, that no student would be overlooked. But what it really did was narrow education down to standardized testing. Literacy and math scores became the measure of schools, teachers, and students. Everything else, arts, history, civics, critical thinking, Indigenous knowledge, was all pushed aside. Teachers were forced to teach to the test. Students were trained to comply, not to question. And a generation grew up believing that success was nothing more than filling the right bubbles on a multiple choice sheet. At the exact same time, Ontario was already living its own version of the nightmare under Mike Harris. Harris slashed education through his so-called common sense revolution. He introduced the EQAO, ramped up standardized testing, cut teachers, and centralized control. For 15 months, Harris and Bush were in the office at the same time. And the parallels are no coincidence. Conservative parties don't invent these policies in isolation. They share them through groups like the International Democrat Union, a global network where Republicans, Tories, and conservatives from dozens of countries trade strategies. Privatization, austerity, testing, surveillance. It's in the same script. Repeated in different accents. The damage was enormous. Teachers fought back, students resisted, communities were torn apart. When the Liberals took over, under McGuinty and later Wynne, there was some restoration. Smaller class sizes, new supports, Indigenous curriculum, but Wynne was no ally. They both kept the EQAO alive. She managed austerity in a softer voice, and she never dismantled Harris's funding formula that still starves schools today. She polished the ruins but left the structure intact. And because she left it intact, Ford was able to walk right back in and weaponize it again. Now here we are, Calandra at the helm, a government that gutted education in its first year, suddenly obsessed with accountability. Trustees silenced, supervisors installed, police forced back into schools, and the cherry on top, a grade 10 math literacy test, because apparently the great crisis in Ontario education is not collapsing buildings or overcrowded classrooms, missing EAs, or underfunded Indigenous curriculum, not racial inequities and suspensions. No! The crisis is whether a 15-year-old can solve for X. It would be laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. Because the point of this test is not to help students. It's to control what counts as knowledge. By centering math literacy, the government is telling the students that the only learning that matters is the kind that can be measured on a standardized test. Everything else, creativity, history, culture, land-based learning, Indigenous language, art, music, critical thought, is irrelevant. And when you erase those forms of knowledge, you erase the capacity of students to see through lies, to challenge authority, and to resist control. This is how you create a public ready to follow false prophets like Pierre Poilievre and Donald Trump. If all you've been taught is to pass tests, if your education has been reduced to compliance, you don't learn to analyze. You don't learn to question. You don't learn to see the deeper structures of power. You become exactly what the system was designed to produce: obedient, misinformed, and angry at the wrong people. That's why we have Maple Mega. That's why Maple Mega exists in Canada. It's not an accident. It's the direct result of decades of policies that hollowed out education and left the public vulnerable to manipulation. And the OSSTF called it. They warned that the Ford government was starving education while pretending to save it. They pointed to ballooning class sizes, collapsing infrastructure, and disappearing supports. They said the government was engineering a crisis, and they were right. Because once you engineer a crisis, you get to sell the solution. And the solution is always more control, more centralization, more obedience, never more freedom, never more diversity of knowledge, never more truth. The hypocrisy is stunning because conservatives claim to care about preparing kids for the future, but the real goal is to shrink the future down to something they can manage. They don't want citizens who can challenge them. They want workers who can calculate but not critique. They want voters who can budget a household but not question a budget bill. They want obedience dressed up as literacy. And of course, when they talk about literacy, they never mean Indigenous literacy. They never mean the knowledge embedded in language and land and ceremony and community. For First Nations controlled schools, the very idea of narrowing education down to a math test is absurd. Our education is holistic. It's about balance between mind, body, spirit, community. It's about accountability, not to a minister in Toronto, but to our ancestors, our clans, our future generations. When Ontario insists that the only thing that counts is math scores, it's not just an insult to Indigenous students. It's a reminder of the colonial project itself. Erase everything but the knowledge that serves the state. This is why the global dimension matters, because it shows this is not just bad policy, it's a coordinated strategy. Bush did it in the US, Harris did it in Ontario. Conservatives worldwide have been refining it for decades through groups like the IDU. And now Ford and Calandra are carrying it forward in Ontario's third Conservative term. It's not about children. It's not about learning. It's about power and always has been about power. So what do we do with that knowledge? We expose it. We refuse to let them dress up control as accountability. We refuse to let them pretend that standardized testing equals success. We refuse to accept a world where education is narrowed to compliance because the truth is education is resistance. Real education teaches you to question, teaches you to see connections, to recognize lies, to challenge authority. Real education includes math, yes, but it also includes the stories, the languages, the ceremonies, the histories that make us whole. If Ontario's government insists on pushing math above all else, then we need to push back with the truth. Numbers without knowledge are meaningless. You can teach a student to solve for x, but if you never teach them why the equation exists in the first place, you've not educated them. You've trained them. And training produces obedience, not freedom. And that's the ultimate danger. Because a public that has been trained but not educated will follow anyone who promises easy answers. They'll follow Trump. They'll follow Polyev. They'll follow Ford. They'll follow Calandra. They'll follow the very people who broke them, believing those same people are the ones who will fix it. And that's not an accident. That's a plan. So, to be clear, the grade 10 math literacy test is not a harmless little benchmark. It's the Ontario version of No Child Left Behind. It's the colonial narrowing of education dressed up as accountability. It's the latest chapter in a global conservative project designed to weaken democracy by weakening education. And until we resist it, unless we fight for something different, we'll keep producing generations trained to obey, not generations ready to lead. Because education should never be about control. Education should never be about obedience. Education should never be about reducing knowledge to what can be measured on a test. It should be about truth, freedom. It should be about the full range of human knowledge, math and story, science and ceremony, literacy and land. That is what they fear. And that is why they fight so hard to take it away. We've walked through the wreckage of what the Ford government is doing to education. The silencing of trustees, the takeover of school boards, the return of police in schools, and the hollow promise of math literacy testing. And we've seen how none of it is accidental. It's the part of a global conservative project that's been stripping education of its soul for decades, turning schools into factories of compliance rather than spaces of truth. The cost is not just measured in scores or budgets. It's measured in the loss of critical thought, in the erasure of Indigenous knowledge, in narrowing of what counts as education. It's measured in students who are trained to obey, but not to question, in families who are left voiceless, in communities that are silenced. But the truth remains. Education is not theirs to weaponize, it's ours to reclaim. We know that real education is broader than their tests, deeper than their numbers, stronger than their politics. Real education lives in land, in language, history, and in the courage to speak when those in power would rather us stay silent. That's the fight ahead, not just to protect schools, but to defend the very idea of education as freedom. And just a reminder, this November, come to Picton in beautiful Prince Edward County for the second run of Shatterbox Theater's production of Cabaret the Musical. The first run was completely sold out. Half of our tables are already sold right now, so don't wait to get your tickets. I'll be returning to my role as Ernst Ludwig, once again as the Cape is transformed into the seedy Kit Kat Club of the underbelly of 1930s Berlin. Come on down, stay a while, get your table, because here, life is beautiful. Get your tickets at kitkatclub.ca, that's kitkatclub.ca, and follow KitKat Club PEC and Shatterbox Theater on social media. They're going fast, and the show isn't even until November, so book your table. You'll love it.
Oh, the river Rhine sings by the linden tree. Its melody